So in the previous lesson we saw how we can view the contact details by clicking on one of these buttons. In this lesson we are going to handle forms, both to be able to create a contact and eventually in another lesson to update a contact. If we click on Add New, at the moment, as we have already done before, this form is static. So in this lesson we will see how to actually make it work. So let's head over to the editor and open the Contacts Create view. In other words, the Create blade. Since we are going to use the same form for both creating the contact and updating an existing contact, I suggest to move this form into its own separate file. This is usually known as a partial view, but don't worry about the semantics. We will eventually be able to import this partial view inside both the Create and the Edit views. Let us therefore cut the form inputs. In other words, all the lines inside this div class. So from lines 13 to 71, and I want to cut it out. And replace these lines by an include statement, which we are going to call contacts dot underscore form. Anytime you see a view with an underscore in the beginning of the name, it usually means that this is a partial view. So inside the contacts folder, let's create a new file and call it form.blade.php. As I mentioned, this is going to be a partial view. It is still a view like the other views. The only difference and the only reason we call it partial view is that we import it from other views. In this case, we will simply paste all the contents in this file. If we look at this file, you can easily observe that we have some select tags which are static, which we have some static companies. So let's replace these guys with the companies which are in our database. And in order to do so, we need to go inside our contact controller. Remember, any kind of business logic needs to be done in the controller and not the actual view. So inside the contact controller, we want to have the following line inside the create method. This line is going to select all the companies ordered by name, and we are using the pluck method to select only the name and the ID fields. And when we finish, I want to prepend the resulting array with a string called all companies. And the reason we're doing this is that when you click on the drop-down menu, you want to see all the companies one after the other, but the very top of the menu will have a string called all companies. Apart from that, all companies will be attached to an empty string, which you will see later what that will do. Last but not least, I want to pass this companies variable to the view create. So now let's go back to the create view. Let's make sure we save it, and we also go to the form partial view and remove the option tags and replace it with the code. So we're going to remove lines 44 to lines 47, and rather than having static company names, we're going to generate them easily using a loop statement. So we're going to loop through the company's variable. It's an associative array, so it takes the syntax, and we are generating an option for each company. And we want to have the value coming from the ID and the name of the company. So now, if I reload the browser, I have a very simple error which I can easily fix because I have not imported the company model. So let's do it very quickly. Reload the browser, and as you can see, the drop-down menu is populated with the list of the companies. So let's save this branch and we'll move on to the next feature in a moment. And now we are ready to post this form and having the action wired into the logic of this form. So let's go back to the create blade view, and let's wrap the form partial in a form tag. So the form partial is this one here, and we want to wrap it inside a form action. I will explain what that line means. Additionally, we want to add a CSRF tag. This will provide additional cross-site request forgery protection from CSRF cybersecurity attacks. So this is a very commonly known technique, and it will enable tokens inside of our form. So what we want to do is that when the form is submitted with the post method, we want to go to a route called contacts store, which we haven't yet defined, but we will do so in a moment. The contacts store will eventually be responsible to save the new contact. So let's open our routers file, which is inside of the routes folder web.php, and let's define a new route like so. Save the file, reload the browser. If everything is correct, you should not see any difference except when we click the save button. Okay, so in this case nothing happens because we are not doing anything with this route yet. So now we need to go to our contact controller and define our store method. The store method will take a store request and will take a request data type, and we are going to capture it inside the request variable. In other words, anything we type inside this form is going to be stored inside a request object of type request. If we want to see the contents, we can simply use DD, which stands for data dump, and we will display the content inside the browser. So now we can have some email, some phone, some address, and the company name. And when we click save, we should get some output. So as you can see here, the data dump has created an array, it generated a CSRF token, and all the fields populated accordingly. So if you've reached so far, well done. We have managed to capture the user input and output it in, let's say, a raw form, but we still managed to capture that format. So let me commit this branch and I will be back in a minute. Before actually saving this data into a database, it is a good idea to first validate the data. So in this lesson, or second part of the lesson, I'm going to implement form validation. Form validation is very important. Don't just accept the data from a form and save it to the database, because that is why applications get hacked. So back to the contact controller, we need to update the store method so that instead of having a data dump, we will actually take the request and use the inbuilt Laravel validate function to validate our fields. We'll start by the first name, and we need to specify that the first name is required, and we're going to do the same thing with last name. The email, we also specify that the email needs to be as an email format. We go ahead with the address and finally the company ID. For the company ID, again, we need to make sure that it is required, but also we need to make sure that it exists inside the company's table inside the column ID. And this is a very important step because we do not want the user somehow to hijack that ID with a non-existing company. In our case, the company is going to be, of course, selected from a drop-down menu, but we will still assume that there might be a hacker trying to hijack our data. Notice also that all fields are marked as required, and the fields that are not marked as required, such as phone, I did not go ahead and validate it. Now, I think it's a good idea to still keep that DD going on, but I'm going to move it after the validation. So I'm still going to make sure that I have this data dump. So if you refresh the browser and everything remains the same, it means that nothing is wrong and that our validation is correct. All the fields were entered as required, and we have no problem with validation. On the other hand, if, let's say, the first name is not entered and I click save, I get some form of strange behavior, because this should be an error which we will fix in a moment. However, as I said, if everything is correct and I click save, I should get an output. Eventually, I will replace this output by persisting the data to the database. Okay, so for a moment, let's just imagine that this means that the data has been saved to the database. Now, something else that I want you to notice is that we have this kind of error message. Now, this has nothing to do with our programming so far. This is actually hard-coded in the view and the layout of the form.html view that we copied. So let's go back to the view and try to update it. So in the form partial, first of all, over here, you can find the class invalid feedback with the please choose a username. And you can also notice we have this class here, which is called isInvalid. This is a special bootstrap class which when enabled, it will use its own CSS rules, such as small text in red, and displays an invalid feedback message to the user over here. And this is quite handy because now we can programmatically determine whether to make this class appear or not, depending on whether we have an error. And in Laravel, this is actually quite straightforward. Conveniently, Laravel provides a directive called @error, which is generated anytime we use validation. So what we can do is wrap the isInvalid class inside the error directive. So if I have a problem with validating first name, like so, then this class is going to appear. So the @error directive works on specific fields as long as it is validated inside the validate method. So we have 5 different validations that we can use inside of our partial form view. So the first one is the first name field, and we are checking if there is any error, and if there is an error, the isInvalid class is going to be flagged. The second part that we need to do, of course, is determine that if there is an error on this first name, I want to show this div box here with the message. So rather than having please choose username, we can say $message. That is a special variable that is generated by the validate function. So make sure that anything that you want to display in case of an error is first of all enveloped inside an error directive, like we have done here and here. And if you want to display the error message, rather than hard coding the message yourself, you can leave up to Laravel to display the message for you by using the $message. This message is generated anytime we use the validate function. So let's test this error, and if I refresh, you can see that the username error that we saw previously, which was hard-coded, disappeared. And if I click save, now I can see the actual error. The first name field is required because the first name field had a strict validation of required over here. So pause the video and go ahead and repeat the same thing with the rest of the fields of the form blade view. Alright, let's compare our answers. So first of all, we had the last name, which is identical to the first name. We also have the email, which is also identical. We have the address, which we also have identical. And we also have the company ID. In this case, we need to be very careful because although we sandwich the error here, over here we need to make sure that the error is on the company ID just after the select tags. We can test our new contact form with all the fields being validated by clicking on save, and we can confirm that all validation is as expected. Now we have one little problem which hopefully we will solve in the next moment. So if let me refresh the form again, and I enter one of the fields and click save, you can see that the first field got erased from the actual input box, and the rest of the fields have the red outline error validation as expected. So we somehow need to let this value persist in the form input. So let's go back to the form view, the form partial view, and we need to add an important attribute to all fields to enable persistency. Okay, we need to make sure that when we click save and there is an error, I can still see the old value. Laravel made it relatively easy for us by adding a directive called old, actually a method called old. So inside the value of, where is it? Okay, inside the input, we need to add an attribute called value. Okay, so if you remember from HTML, we can override what the input box displays to the user by having a value attribute. And therefore I would suggest to place it just after the ID attribute. And inside the value attribute we are going to use the old method, and this is a very handy method provided to us by Laravel, and this will simply repopulate the field by the previous value. In this case, by the previous value of the first name field. So let's go ahead and do the same thing with the other fields. Alright, have you managed to do it? So let's compare the code together. So remember, we need to add the value attribute to all the fields, making sure that each field gets the previous value of that input box. When it comes to, however, the address, we need to be a little bit careful, because in the address we need to specify it inside the text area. Alright, remember, the text area, you do not have a value attribute, you simply add it inside here. And inside the selects, we need to simply update the option tag, and we do a very straightforward conditional statement. And we simply say, if the ID is selected, then replace it by the previous company ID, otherwise keep it blank. Okay? In other words, the selection must be the previous ID that we selected. So let's save the file and check it out. So let's say we have Facebook, we click save, the rest of the fields have the validation error, but the company is still selected on Facebook. If we have some address over here, we do the same thing, right? And we get our data inside of our data dump. The last step is switching the data dump to the actual data persistency into the database. And honestly, that is the easiest part. So back to the contact controller, we should comment out the data dump or remove it completely, and instead we're going to replace it by a contact create. So we're creating a new record, and the record is going to be all of this request. Once the request is saved, we can redirect the user back to the context by saying return redirect to the route called contacts.index. While we're here, we can also pass a session message in our redirect by using the with method. So let's go ahead and pass a message, a custom session message, and the with method takes two attributes. The first one is the key, so we're going to call this message message, and the actual contents of the message. So contact has been added successfully, like so. Now we can actually display this particular message from inside our index view. Remember, once the contact is being created, we are redirecting the user to the index view. So let's switch to the index view, and at the very beginning of the table, specifically at the beginning of the T-body tag over here, we can say if there is a message, there is a session message, so if message equals session message, okay, then let's close the if, then we want to display that message. And if you're using Bootstrap, you may use the alert success classes, okay? If not, use the use the classes that belong to whatever framework you're using. Alright, so if you're using Tailwind, use something related with displaying a success alert message. So let's quickly explain what's happening here. First of all, I'm going to check if there is a session message called message, and if there is, just display it over here. Now, we might still have some issue here, so let's try it out. Okay, so we still have an issue because if you remember, inside of our contact model, we have not added our company ID inside the fillable array. So that should do it. So let's try it again. And now we have our contact has been added successfully. And this is the message we are supposed to get. And for some reason I am getting it twice, so let me check whether Copilot has hijacked, yeah, okay, Copilot has hijacked my my code here. Okay, so let's do it again and add new, let's call it Bob. Hello Bob, and now we have Bob over here. Okay, and while we're here, by the way, we can still check all of this. So if you managed to get so far, well done. Now you are able to create a contact and save it to the database. I'll see you in the next lesson to show you how to update a data.